We've been following the incredible violence at Donald Trump protests over the last several months, increasingly so. And I could think of no better interview to revisit this week than our interview all the way back in 2010 with a cartoonist and political commentator and activist, I guess we could call him, Ted Rall. This interview we did with Ted back in 2010 created a little bit of a stir because Ted Rall actually talked about the role of violence and using violence and getting physical when it may help achieve a political objective. And I want to think of this interview in the context of the Trump rallies today, in the context of the Bernie Sanders candidacy and the way in which some Bernie Sanders supporters have been clashing not physically but ideologically with Hillary Clinton supporters. And I've talked a lot about the potential for how that could be bad for Democrats once we get beyond the primary. And there's so many ways in which this classic interview with Ted Rall back from 2010 is so relevant to what's going on today. So we'll go back to November of 2010 for today's classic interview. Hey, welcome back to the show. Ted Rall is joining us. He is the author of the book, The Anti-American Manifesto, which I have here in front of me. Hey, Ted, good to see you.
Likewise, how are you?
So it's not every day that that somebody goes on TV and starts talking about the possibility that we would need violence, or at least the threat of violence, to really inspire change. And I love the fact that if you Google your name right now, the Tea Partiers and Fox News are going nuts over the things that you said on Dylan Ratigan's show the other day.
That is true. They are crazy. It's kind of amazing how little it really takes to anger them. And what's also really weird is how long it took them to discover that the book was out. This book came out in. Let me turn this off.
Uh-oh.
I got my other phone going. Okay, there we go. Anyway, it's amazing to me that it took so long for them to discover that the book was out. It came out in September, and now here we are in late November, and they finally noticed that this book called The Anti-American Manifesto was sitting in bookstores. I have to assume it's because they never go to bookstores. But
that could be the case. So, give me a sense of when you say that violence or the threat of violence, which are two totally different things in reality. Why would those be necessary? I mean, is it because the current system is not working? And what is it exactly that you want to change?
Well, I want to change everything. The violence is already in the system. The reason that I'm opposed to the system is that it is violent. I'm opposed to the violence of the unspeakable violence of the wars against Afghanistan and Iraq, the occupation of Haiti, and a lot of other similar outrages around the world. I'm outraged at the violence against the planet, the destruction of the environment, etc. And I'm outraged, not least, at the violence of the capitalist system and the brutal corporations that are throwing people out of their homes, even though they haven't even done anything wrong, many of whom have even paid their mortgages up to date, using fraudulent paperwork. The system is brutal. And so the violence is already here among us. And just to be really clear on this, no one likes violence. No one's sane. And I'm opposed to it, and the violence is why I'm against want to change everything. But you have to, when you're taking on this violence colossus, you have to be willing to not tie one hand behind your back. You've got to avail yourself of violence and the credible threat of violence as a tool in your arsenal in the event that you need it. What's gone wrong with the left for the last 40 years, among many other organizational issues, is that they have sort of sworn pacifism above all else. So the system isn't really afraid. You can have 1 million people march in the streets against the war in Iraq, but the president isn't worried that this might get out of control and that maybe he should ramp down and maybe not invade Iraq or go in later or go in smaller or not go in at all. There's no worry there because, after all, everyone's all peaceful and nothing's going to happen. And it's been so long since anything happened that there is no real credible threat.
But so are you saying, in a sense, that in order to, for example, with the war in Iraq as an example, just because George W. Bush's book is out now, we've been hearing from him a lot of the logic or lack of logic that took place there. Should liberals have gotten out onto the street, or not necessarily just liberals, whoever was against the war, and become violent? And if so, against who? Against the police? I mean, certainly they don't deserve it.
Well, it is their jobs. honestly. That's why they have those big guns. I think that, let's just go back to 2003. We know that what we did not work. I say we because I marched too. We marched in the streets peacefully. We walked around. We chanted our slogans. We went home. We ate dinner. We went to sleep. Nothing happened. The tanks rolled in the next day, just as if nothing had happened. Which, in a sense, nothing had happened. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, to paint a picture, that Washington, D.C. had burned half to the ground due to riots. Do you think they would have gone in quite so quickly? Or do you think the next time they were thinking about invading a foreign country, like, say, the way they invaded Haiti after the earthquake, do you think that would have happened as quickly? Probably not. I mean, you can see what's going on now in England with the tuition increase riots, and in France with the Social Security retirement age riots. The government knows not to screw with its people too much. Otherwise, things get out of control. And that's not good for business. And, government exists primarily to make sure that business keeps going.
Well, it's interesting because in the two cases you cite over in Europe, and my dad was recently in France, and he was kind of in the middle of what is going on there. There is a sense that the changes or potential changes directly affect the everyday lives of the people, whereas the war in Iraq, as we've talked about, both sides have said, nobody in the U.S. has really sacrificed other than the members of the military and their families specifically because we are in this war. So in a sense, it's easy to just, do your protest, hold your sign, and then go home and get back to what you were doing, right?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, the lack of a draft is a big part of the reason, as many analysts have pointed out, that there's no forward motion on a real protest movement. I mean, people aren't vested. I mean, it's kind of sad to think that we have to personally be threatened with being sent to a war and killed before we start to care, but apparently that's what we Americans are made of.
So would you favor a draft?
I would really favor, to echo the Tea Party, some constitutional purity. According to our Constitution, only Congress can declare war. I'd like to take it one step further. I mean, the presidents have been stealing that right for really ever since Thomas Jefferson, and it's gotten really bad in the 20th century. But I would love to see a war subjected to a national referendum. I don't think if under 80% of the country are willing to support a war, I don't really see how we could go ahead with it. I mean, after all, even if you're not fighting it or giving your sons or daughters to fight it, we're all paying an enormous price financially for these wars. I mean, right now, war accounts for 54% of the U.S. federal budget. Right now, 19% of your federal tax dollar goes to paying the interest on old wars. So, war is our national business, and it's something that we should all be voting on. And I bet if there'd been a vote on the war against Iraq or the war against Afghanistan, I bet those wars wouldn't have taken place,
Hey, I don't want to get into the full story of how you became a cartoonist, but I've reviewed the story, and I do like your work quite a bit. Can you solve an ongoing discussion that's taking place in studio here between my producer and myself, which is this? My producer is a big fan of South Park, and I've always told him I find it to be completely unwatchable, in part because of the drawings. And at the same time, he's told me, well, you know what? The Family Guy drawings have been criticized by the South Park guys because they're just overly simplistic and too easy to draw. As a guy who is a scholar of the cartoon, so to speak, can you tell me how important the way the cartoon is drawn should be compared to the message that is contained within it?
Well, I'm going to side with you, David, on the issue of South Park. I personally think those guys are great, and I love Team America, the movie. But you're siding?
Okay.
But I find South Park unwatchable.
Gotcha.
I think the humor is great, but the art makes my eyes bleed. It's a visual medium. At bare minimum, the art should be inoffensive, or you should be able to at least tolerate watching it for 30 straight minutes, which I just can't. But of course, this is subjective, and there are lots of people who feel differently. I think it's surprising about Family Guy. I think with Family Guy, the art's just super generic, very Hanna-Barbera influenced. Just like The Simpsons. There's not much to it, really.
Sure.
And that's fine. I like simple art. I draw. I personally use very abstract drawing, and I like it that way. But, one person's fine art is another person's crap.
Any comment on that, Louis?
Well, I'm just this brings to mind a show that was not on for very long called Tom Goes to the Mayor, and the show wasn't even animated. It was just still images that sometimes they would zoom in on, and I could still watch that. And I thought it was hilarious.
So I think what we see is Louis just has a very low barometer for what he'll watch, right?
Well, that's hey, that's great. Personally, I mean, I don't really, I'm not an art slut at all. I mean, I don't really care if someone has a beautiful line, and I do think the message is the most important thing by far. And if the satire is good, that's great. I just find South Park easier to listen to than to watch.
All right, we've been speaking with Ted Rall. The book is the Anti-American Manifesto. I recommend it highly. I read it myself. Thanks so much for joining us, Ted.
My pleasure.
Okay, we'll talk to you soon.